Center for Health and Safety Culture, and welcome to our webinar today on a very complex, interesting topics around laws, policies, and rules, and how do they change behavior. We will be recording today's session, so if you have to leave or you want other folks to see it later on, or if you want to listen to aspects of it again, you'll be able to come back to our website and see it on the website. We'll have it posted in just a couple of days. We'll also try to have some time at the end for some open conversation and some question and answer, so know that's available. So just quickly a little bit of background about the Center. The Center for Health and Safety Culture is a part of the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University, and we conduct research on how culture influences health and safety. And it's a very big, complex topic, and we really like to talk about it through the lens of culture with a small c. So we're looking at aspects of shared values, attitudes, and beliefs, and we're looking at it in a variety of contexts. It could be broadly as a state or a county. It could be very small in terms of an organization or a workplace or a school. But that's our basic work, and while we conduct we do a lot of research. All of our research is applied, working with sponsors who are seeking to move the needle on specific projects. We also think our work is not just about the research, but also how we bring that research out to communities. So training and providing guidance to communities about how to apply some of these ideas is very important to us as well. Here's a very quick map of past and current projects. So while we're located in Bozeman, Montana, we actually do projects all across the country. We've done a couple of projects in Canada as well. Actually, about half of our staff are remote. I'm actually calling in from Maryland today, and so our staff is all across the country as well. So what we wanted to do today was really explore this interesting idea of how do laws, policies, and rules change behavior, especially in the context of health and safety. Now, this is an extremely complex topic, and even understanding the notion of how laws in particular start to influence things is very complex, especially if you get into it from a legal standpoint and looking at how laws may impact other laws and the interpretation of laws and interpretation of the Constitution. That's well beyond the scope of what we'll be talking about here today. I am not an attorney and don't want to portray to be a legal expert, but looking at it more from the lens of very practical and applied work in community at impacting health and safety, we all know that laws, policies, and rules are very important. And I think it's interesting for us to explore some of the mechanisms by which they may impact behavior. And from that, perhaps identify ways that we can leverage and make them more impactful by understanding some of those potential mechanisms. So that's our task for this afternoon. At the center, we work primarily in three core big issues. We do a lot of work in traffic safety. We have historically and continue to do a lot of work in substance abuse and prevention. And we're getting more and more involved in aspects of violence prevention, child maltreatment, child well-being. And of course, these three issues overlap and together contribute to a significant amount of public health concern across our country. And it's interesting to see how this concept of laws, policies, and rules permeate these three different issues. There's some significant similarities and there's some differences. So I'll try to talk about it through aspects of all three of these broad issues. To begin with, I think it's just interesting to begin with some basic definitions, and I'm not posing these as the right or only definitions, but a very basic definition of a law being a system of rules for a particular country or community that recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and may be enforced by the imposition of penalties. So I think we often think about these certainly in our work in a context of a state, or it could be a community, it could be a city. It might be also called things like ordinances. and definitely having a sense of a penalty and an aspect of enforcement. And clearly an aspect of this are the behaviors of the whatever enforcement agency. A policy being similar but maybe slightly different, a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, a party, a business, or an individual. So a little bit broader here, but clearly we can see overlap. And when we move to a rule, the idea of one of a set of explicit or understood regulations or principles governing conduct within a particular activity or sphere. So certainly a lot of overlap. I think often when we think about these, we often think about these also in the context of the social ecology. So we in our work in thinking about culture and how shared beliefs, shared values, attitudes, and beliefs and behaviors start to influence other people's behaviors, like to look at it through the lens of the social ecology. Depending upon the issue or the specific behavior we're addressing, the social ecology can look slightly different. But at the center is going to be an individual with related layers, nested layers of relationships that can influence that individual. And I think we can sort of see that laws often reside at a community level. That could be broadened out to a state or a city or a region, but laws often operating there, being applied to everyone and being enforced by some sort of law enforcement agency often. Oftentimes when we talk about policies, it may be policies around enforcement, which could be at a community level, but also thinking about policies maybe in a workplace context or a school context, where there certainly is a degree of enforcement, but enforcement looks very different for sure. A violation of a policy could also overlap with the violation of a law and involve law enforcement, but certainly workplace policies can also be at a lower level. And then certainly family rules, that's the context that we often think about rules as family rules, and those seeking to echo maybe what policies or laws are saying, but it could be family rules about underage drinking, about never driving after drinking, or always wearing a seatbelt, or things like that. So I think it is interesting to think about laws, policies, and rules also in the context of the social ecology. Now, to look at these from a very simplistic idea of how do they work or how do they influence behavior, one very simple lens is to look at once a law is established, we're going to identify those who violate the law. We're going to punish those violators, and through that punishment, seek to modify those violators' behaviors. There's obviously a lot to each of these. When we think about identifying violators, that also means we're going to have some degree of an aspect of justice and due process where we're not going to punish somebody unless we have a strong reason to believe they violated the law. What punishment looks like can also obviously vary, and does punishment include sort of an aspect, additional aspects of modifying behavior? Is punishment just retribution, or is punishment seeking to actively change behavior? We know obviously in substance abuse settings, punishment may not be the mechanism that really changes behavior, where we're going to have to really think about treatment or other aspects. So this is overwhelmingly simplified, but still, I think it's an interesting place to begin. I think some folks in the general public and other settings may view the work of a law as to be, this is how it works. We establish a law, we identify those who violate the law, we punish them, and then they change their behavior. And certainly this is built on an underlying assumption that people want to avoid punishment. And the punishment can look like many different things. I mean, certainly there's a punishment in the sense of you could pay a fine, so there's an economic cost. Punishment could be embarrassment. I mean, certainly historically, the public stocks, putting somebody in the center of town. I think we still have an element of that mechanism that occurs in communities as well, where we list everybody who was arrested or cited for something, so that there's this element of public shame. So public punishment can come in many different forms, and we're not going to debate the efficacy of those different forms or those mechanisms. But the underlying notion is that people wanting to avoid this form of punishment and therefore modifying their behaviors. Even with this simple idea, I think it's interesting to look at, so how well does this work? Is enforcement, this sort of lens of an enforcement, sufficient? So, for example, around substance abuse, the data would say we have about 28 million monthly users of illicit drugs in the United States. And in 2012, it's a little bit dated, but I don't think we're going to see huge changes in these numbers. You have about 1.6 million arrests. So if we're really thinking that we're going to change behavior around illicit drug use to improve health and safety by arresting folks, we have a huge gap there in the difference between how many folks are engaging in potentially risky behavior and how many folks are arrested. So it's just interesting to ask that question. I think if we look at it from a traffic safety lens, there are about 110 million impaired driving episodes in the U.S. in 2014. 110 million. There were about 1.3 million arrests for driving under the influence in 2012, and that's not even prosecutions, that's just arrests. The prosecutions would be less than that. So again, you can see there's a huge gulf between individuals engaging in a risky behavior and the number of arrests. And that's important to note. So just starting to look at this and ask this question, is enforcement sufficient? And again, if we look at it through a violence lens, there are about 5 million violent victimizations in 2015, and there were about 1.7 million arrests. So the ratios are better there. We certainly have a higher degree of arrests, and that's probably very appropriate because some of these violent victimizations include horrific crimes, rape, and other things like that. So we really hope that we're engaging in really active efforts to arrest those folks. But it recognizes that this broad question is enforcement sufficient? And I think what folks would realize is that it's clearly necessary. If we don't enforce laws at all, the law disappears. I mean, folks aren't following, are losing sense that it's real. But it's also this recognition that it's not sufficient, that we're not going to enforce our way out of this. And certainly I've had many law enforcement officers that I've worked with say that, yes, we want to address traffic safety, and we're not going to enforce our way out of this. So law enforcement can't be the single solution, but just passing a law and handing it off to law enforcement isn't viable to address many of the issues we face, but it is very much necessary. Now, I do want to echo sort of a word of caution. While the data that I just shared with you are extremely important, those are not messages that we want to put out broadly, because we don't want the general public to know that a lot of people who engage in either illicit drug use or driving under the influence or violence are not arrested. If people have that perception that they can engage in those behaviors and not be arrested, that could clearly increase those behaviors. So this is important for us to understand, but this is not messaging that we would put out broadly. That could have a really negative impact on addressing these behaviors. So it's very important to understand. But I think it helps us understand that this is clearly not going to be enough. We have to move beyond enforcement. Yes, enforcement is necessary, but not sufficient. So then how else might we understand the impact of how laws can influence behavior? And that's where I think where we want to start to think about our role with enforcement or passing laws isn't just to identify and arrest or have law enforcement reach those people. We have to reach those people on their own, and that's where we would, through our work, sort of bring in a lens of a behavioral model. So then it's not going to be about the law enforcement officer changing somebody's behavior. It's going to be about the impact of the law changing people's beliefs that then start to influence their behavior. So when we look at a behavioral model like this, on the far right side, we're identifying different risky or protective behaviors that people may or may not engage in. So this could be a risky behavior, could be driving under the influence of alcohol. It could be choosing to wear a seatbelt. That would be a protective behavior. It could be engaging in violence. We also recognize that this is a rational behavior model, and certainly when we're talking about substance abuse and issues of addiction, this model can clearly break down because the brain is operating in a different way. It's been rewired through brain processes related to addiction, so it becomes very complex. But nonetheless, for some of our behaviors like underage drinking or things like that where addiction is not taking place necessarily, we can still think about a rational model and how it may influence our understanding. In this model, we're going to recognize that risky or protected behaviors are, to a degree, preceded by a certain willingness or intention, and it's that willingness or intention that we really want to impact. Other factors will come to bear. So certainly somebody doesn't drink and drive if they never drive or they don't have a car, so that there's broader environmental factors that influence engagement and behavior. But nonetheless, from a beliefs perspective, what we're really trying to see is how can we use laws, policies, and rules to influence people's belief systems to reduce willingness or intention to engage in risky behaviors and increase willingness or intention to engage in protective behaviors like wearing a seatbelt. So to look at that, we really want to move to the more on the left side of this model and look at some of these beliefs and how some of these beliefs may be impacted by laws, policies, and rules, and understand that better. So let's begin with the one at the top, behavioral beliefs. When we think about behavioral beliefs, these are expectations about engaging in a behavior, and they inform our attitude about the behavior and ultimately our potentially our willingness or intention to engage in that behavior. So these might have positive expectancies. We can have positive expectancies around behavioral beliefs, like, underage drinking. We might say, well, I can dance better when I drink. And that may be true or not. I mean, it could be false. It's like the person doesn't dance better when they drink, but they think they do. And that's a belief. And it could be a positive expectancy, and we might laugh at this. But certainly a positive expectancy that youth do have about underage drinking is that I can socialize better. And whether that's true or not is not necessarily of question. But if they think it's true, then it might lead them to choose to drink. Likewise, we can have negative expectancies, which are behavioral beliefs. And certainly when we think about laws, a negative expectancy is I may be arrested. I may be cited and lose my job for a workplace policy, or my parents would kill me. Not literally, but I would violate the rule that and get in a lot of trouble with my parents. So laws, policies, and rules can clearly create a sense of negative expectancies for engaging in a behavior, which may well go beyond like a perception of harm. Like I'm not worried about what alcohol does to my brain, but I am worried about getting arrested and what that could do. And that's an important negative expectancy. And that's a way, if we can grow that expectancy, we might be able to influence people's behavior without having to necessarily arrest them. So this is all about a sense of a perception of getting caught, which is why it's extremely important not to communicate to people that, actually, if you drink and drive, you're less likely to get caught. You're more likely not to get caught. But we don't want people to know that. We want to amplify a sense of a perception of getting caught. So when we think about this, it's a notion of the belief of getting caught is what potentially motivates compliance, and that broad perspective of avoiding that punishment associated with that, which could be a wide variety of things. It could be a fine, but it could also be a sense of embarrassment. Then we have to maintain the perception of getting caught. And this is interesting because certainly like in traffic safety, we use various strategies that we may use national campaigns like Click It or Ticket that occur in a period of time where there's a lot of media and a lot of awareness around this, and there's high visibility enforcement. And that's about creating that perception of getting caught. The challenge we can see is that people absolutely modify their behavior during that time, but then when the campaign is over, their perception of getting caught may go down, and their behavior comes back. So we haven't sustained the behavior change. We've definitely influenced their behavior, but because the perception of getting caught varies based on a campaign, their behavior starts to vary. So we have to think about this too, and how might we keep a perception of getting caught expanded over time and not dwindle or degrade after a certain campaign. And certainly one notion of that in traffic safety is automated enforcement, and the recognition that we've used, jurisdictions have used red light cameras, which are always at that intersection. And people would say, well, it modifies their behavior at that intersection, but it might not modify their behavior at another intersection. And that can be true, and there are different strategies around that. But it's that notion that then at that intersection, at least, we've created a constant sense of enforcement and started to, and the research would show, I think, changing behavior there. But this is a critical challenge of if our strategy is to avoid punishment, we have to maintain a sense of getting caught. Now, it's also interesting when we think about avoiding punishment, it goes beyond this. There was a fascinating study that was done with children to start to explore how do we develop ideas around how laws work. And these researchers said, well, let's look at very young children and then look at older and older children to see how their beliefs varied as they developed, and that might give us some interesting insights. And during this experiment, they created two videos, or it was a video of two virtual worlds, and one world had square shapes, and the other world had triangle shapes, I think, and they were like people, but they were the square shapes and the triangle shapes. And in the square-shaped world, one square shape took the ice cream of another square shape, and nothing happened. And in the triangle world, one triangle took the ice cream of another triangle, and then that triangle was punished. And so the researchers asked, and they did a lot of setup to make this effective, but they asked very young children, which world would you like to live in? And very young children, the 5 to 6-year-olds, wanted to live in the world where there wasn't punishment. And developmentally, it was a sense that they could probably identify a little bit more with the square shape that wanted to take the ice cream than sort of the punishment, and they didn't want to get punished. But what was interesting is by the age of 8 to 9, children did want to live in the world where the shapes were punished. They had moved beyond thinking not so much about me and what would happen in me being punished, but rather this is the world I'd rather live in because it felt safer and it felt more just. And so this is moving beyond to what it's going to do to me to more of a sense of around norms. And so I'd rather be in a community that had safe norms. And so this is where laws and enforcing the laws, making them real, helps to establish the norms of a community. And so now we can sort of reconnect with our behavioral model. This is a whole nother set of beliefs, normative beliefs. And we want to explore a little bit about understanding through the lens of norms how laws and policies may impact. So a set of beliefs are perceived norms, and these are an individual's general perceptions of what is common or expected about a behavior. And in particular, we're going to focus on the expectations. And it's really the expectation by someone who is important. If someone who is important to me expects me to do something, that has more influence on me than somebody who is not as important. And so it could be my parents expect me not to drink. And this is where a family rule about not drinking can start to influence a child's behavior. It could be the boss does not allow that kind of behavior, so the boss has established rules in a workplace. What we found is that these kinds of expectations are very influential in workplaces because workplaces are exclusive communities. If you don't align with the rules, you can be removed. So workplace rules or policies can be very impactful on behavior. And then we can move that out to our community, like our community does not tolerate drinking and driving. How does that get manifested? Well, we do have laws about it. We enforce those laws. We care about those laws. There's a whole context set up there. But we can start to see how those laws, policies, and rules can start to create a mechanism to communicate what our expectations are. So in that sense, it's a different way to think about the law. It's not that the law is going to result in enforcement and that's going to change behavior, but we're using the law as a way to create a context for this important communication about what expectations are. And those expectations can span the social ecology, and everybody can have those conversations. So what does it mean for the rules in our family and our workplace and in our community? Well, we can look at each of those, and then when those start to align, we have a really consistent set or a more tight culture around that health and safety issue. So just thinking about it through that lens, I think, helps us see a different way that it can begin to impact. Now, the third class of beliefs that can start to influence people's behaviors are around control beliefs. And control beliefs are my sense of how much control or ability I have to engage in a behavior. And again, it's my perception. It may be not accurate. Maybe I think I'm really good at something. I have the ability to do it, and I don't. Or in some cases, I may actually have the ability to do something, but I don't think I do, so I don't have the confidence to do it. So these are all beliefs, but control beliefs absolutely influence our engagement and behavior, and laws can influence those. So for some folks, a law, policy, or rule may remove a sense of control. In other words, somebody may say, no, I can't do that risky behavior because it's against the law. So it's almost removed the choice for them. I mean, honestly, they may still have the choice, but in their mind, they've lost a sense of control because, no, that would be violating the law, and I don't want to violate the law. I have a sense of ethics or whatever. But So it's interesting to think about laws as a mechanism to maybe remove a sense of control in engaging in a risky behavior. It's also recognized that laws can create a sense of control. And this is in a mechanism where I might be more empowered to speak up to somebody else. So I might say, hey, you can't do that. It's against the law. So, for example, this has been shown in an example like smoking ordinances. In the absence of an ordinance, somebody may not like somebody smoking in a certain context, and even if they controlled that context, like it was their workplace or their home or something, they might feel like they can't speak up about it. But when laws are created, it empowers people to have a sense of, no, now I can take control. Hey, it's against the law to do that, so I can speak up. So we have to think about laws both impacting people's control in that it can reduce a sense of control in terms of engaging in risk behaviors. It may also create a sense of control in engaging in what we might consider protective behaviors or sort of more bystander engagement aspects by empowering people that they're now not alone, but the law is behind them. And so that recognition becomes very important. And these are elements of the expressive theory of law. So to think about it, we can see that laws, policies, and rules can really start to have impact on all kinds of behavioral beliefs, and in that way really have much broader impact on people's behavior well beyond the notion of enforcement. And I think that's really important because it'll inform how we then think about talking about the law. It's also important to recognize the research would show that laws can impact other behaviors, which can then impact the overall behavior. So, for example, when we have a law about not drinking and driving, that may lead us then to question, okay, if somebody was drinking and driving, what's the responsibility of the person who provided alcohol to somebody who then was drinking and driving? So this goes back to beverage server training, which is a best practice around reducing impaired driving. How do I reduce availability of alcohol to people who maybe had too much and may be in a position to drive? So if I'm out at a social setting and I'm going to have to drive after that, maybe I train servers to reduce or not serve people who've had too much so I can then impact the drinking and driving behavior. And this is where the law about drinking and driving started to have broader impacts. We can also see how laws have started to impact then rules about advertising. And clearly, as advertising changes, people's beliefs change. So all of these start to tie together. If we establish a workplace policy, really what we need to couple that with is workplace training. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to create a workplace policy and have no training about it. And the training offers a very powerful opportunity to say why we had the policy, not just what the policy is, but the why behind it, and further change people's beliefs across that behavioral model. Their understanding or perception of harm, what the norms are, how much they're in control, that can all be influenced through workplace training, which could come about because we established a workplace policy. And then even at the family level, we can have a sense of not just establishing a family rule, but really having a family dialogue about why we have that rule and using that as an opportunity to teach family members about maybe aspects of harm or things like that. So they have a deeper understanding, and therefore it's not, am I going to get caught by my parents? That's not the only reason, but I have a deeper understanding of around perception of harm or disapproval. So recognizing that laws, policies, and rules can have these ripple effects to influence other behaviors, and that in fact some of our work may be we have to trigger these other behaviors, that if we pass a law, it's not just about passing the law, but then seeing how that law can ripple out and influence other aspects, because that's going to really expand the impact of the law. Another very interesting idea about how laws impact behavior, this is relatively new, and it's based on an economic theory around ecology or psychology, and it's called the endowment effect. And the endowment effect says we place greater value on things that we have than on things that we don't have. So for example, if I have a jacket, and I like that jacket, and you asked me how much would I have to pay you to buy that jacket from me, I might give you a certain dollar amount. Let's say I'd say it would be $40. And what the research says is that if I didn't have that jacket and I was in a setting where I could buy that jacket, I actually wouldn't pay as much. I might pay $30 to buy it if I didn't have it. But if I had it and you wanted to buy it from me, I would want $40. So the endowment effect is, why did somebody place greater value on something they already had than on something they don't have? It's this endowment effect. And that's been shown to exist around sort of tangible things like that. But these researchers wanted to explore, could an endowment effect impact our engagement with law? And so they wanted to explore the idea of, if a law, policy, or rule creates something of value, might we be more inclined to continue to follow that law because of an endowment effect we've created, giving that law more value because it's created some other value for us? And so this is their hypothesis. It's not been tested, but it's an interesting idea. And so it's this notion of, for example, if I pass a tobacco law, I'm improving the community's health. And I can view it as my individual health, certainly through secondhand smoke. And therefore, as I start to see the law as having that additional value to me, I'm more likely to stand up for it, stand behind it, and make it real and have value to it and influence my behavior than if it didn't exist, or if sort of starting off new. And so the endowment effect idea is that when you first pass a law, you actually have to do a fair amount of communication and even enforcement around it. But then once people start to see the value of the law, that demand of enforcement can often go down because people have started to adapt and somehow and start to value it. We could also see that with something around, improved safety around DUI laws or other things. So clearly the issue becomes here is, how do people start to understand or communicate that notion of a value of a law? They might not recognize that, so we might have to intentionally communicate that. So overall, all that we've been looking at is this recognition that just passing the law, and even just trying to, if we only pass the law and then we just try to enforce a law, that's really just the first step towards changing behavior. And that we want to think much broader than that and not be in a context where it's just up to enforcement. And based on these ideas, we can really start to then maybe have some recommendations about how we can leverage laws, policies, and rules to be broader on our work. So in traffic safety, there is certainly an aspect and a very strong strategy around high visibility enforcement. So we can now start to understand that a little bit more. Really, high visibility enforcement isn't so much about catching people, because we know we're not going to enforce our way out of these issues. And if we make it about enforcing people, we can potentially really trigger social reactance, psychological reactance. And psychological reactance is where people do the opposite of what you want them to do because they feel like you're taking away their freedom. So you do a massive effort on like seatbelt, and you make it all about catching people who aren't wearing their seatbelt. You'll have some people in that population who say, you know, I'm not going to wear my seatbelt. I'm going to see if I can still get away with it, sort of. They do the opposite. And that's not everybody, but there's a portion of the population which can engage in psychological reactance. It can also just create this not a good relationship between the general public and the enforcement agency if your work is about catching people. But if you shift that to about improving health and safety and really view high visibility as enforcement as an opportunity to clarify the norms, the expectations, and actual behaviors in our community, and you use it as an opportunity to create value and improved health and safety. So by doing seatbelt enforcement, we're saving lives, we're keeping you safe, we're keeping members of your family safe, we're having other impacts, like we're reducing workers' comp rates, we're reducing healthcare related rates in terms of insurance, other things like that. This creates value around that. And that becomes a very important message. So then it's really recognizing that the impact of this is going to occur for broad communication. I mean, that's why it's high visibility, right? I mean, if nobody knows you're doing the enforcement, it doesn't reach anybody other than the people you catch. And we're already recognizing that's a small set of the population. So the high visibility, critically important, is this broad communication and the messaging. And that's really what starts to influence behavior change, not so much like counting how many people we caught, because that's a portion of it. Yes, it has to be real, but the impact is really that broader communication. When we think about workplace policies, again, it's not about creating a policy so we can catch people, which can create opposition between leadership and staff, which is not constructive or healthy. But it's really about how do we improve the health and safety of our workplace, and how do we demonstrate our organizational values and our values about the health and safety of our workers, the health and safety of our community, all those things. So if we put it in that context, we can diffuse that psychological reactance and help people see, and it gives us an opportunity for training and teaching about how these behaviors might be risky, and in general people want to avoid hurting themselves, and how we can grow protection and really creating that culture of safety. And this is, I think, a really fascinating area. At our center, we're trying to do more and more work around this idea of safety citizenship. How do we create a culture of safety where it's not just about my safety, but it's about our safety? And then what is my role as a bystander? If I see somebody doing something potentially risky, am I empowered to speak up because I've created this culture, and I'm a good citizen, so I look out for all of our safety, not just my safety. And so the policies can help create that culture. And certainly when we think about families, it creates an opportunity, hopefully, for some very constructive dialogue between perhaps parents and children, or caregivers and children, not in of being an authority figure and just forcing behavior, but really helping children understand the why behind this, recognizing that children are going to grow up to adults, and if they understand the why behind these safety behaviors, they'll carry that on. And so creating a family rule as an opportunity to have really good dialogue, and that it is about improving health and safety. And we can think about it even broader through this lens of growing responsible decision-making, and decision-making and responsible decision-making being a core competency we want certainly in our children around all sorts of issues, not just wearing a seatbelt or not drinking and driving or not drinking at all, but how do we grow just these skills at responsible decision-making that can be applied in all sorts of work. And this is another fun area that we're starting to explore at the center. Now, I don't want to leave this conversation about talking about laws, policies, and rules without absolutely raising very specific concerns, in that enforcement of laws can be misused, and certainly has been misused, and resulting in tremendous harm. and that we can use an enforcement of laws as a way to target people. And I remember one time riding with a law enforcement officer and him just saying, any officer who is worth worth their weight or has any skills at all can pull over anybody. I mean, you can just follow somebody for a period of time and come up with a reasonable cause to pull them over. So there's always a mechanism to do that, but we really have to think about that laws can be misused and have been misused when we use them to target certain people in a mechanism that is not about improving health and safety, and certainly can move to a horrific situation of historically, when we look at laws being applied to, let's say, native peoples and others, that became, in essence, a form of ethnic cleansing, where we were seeking to remove certain people because of the color of their skin or the way that they talked or other things, which is highly inappropriate. So I don't want to leave this conversation without recognizing that laws can absolutely be abused and misused, and that has to be acknowledged in a conversation like this. Now, just to leave you with some questions to think about, I know I've thrown a fair amount of information out pretty quickly, but I think it's always good to have some takeaway questions. So to think about, how can you amplify the impact of laws, policies, and rules in your work by strategically working across the social ecology? So how do we look at, okay, in a traffic safety setting, maybe we want to look at how do we impact the laws around distracted driving, but then how are we also going to take those laws and bring that into the workplace environment with policies and into the home environment with rules, and really start creating this alignment across the social ecology that then begins, builds that consistent culture and start to really get that alignment. So just asking that question and not just stopping with a law. Does the public clearly understand how the law, policy, or rule codifies existing norms? So sometimes we have very strong norms in communities that most people don't engage in a risky behavior. But the challenge is, and we have tons of research to show this, people misperceive those norms. If you ask people, do most people drink and drive? Our surveys show time and time again, overwhelming people think most people drink and drive, when in fact, most people do not drink and drive. So we have to help people realize that laws, policies, and rules are not trying to change often the behavior of the majority of the population. It's usually a small minority of the population who's engaging in risky behavior. The majority of the population gets it and aligns with the norms, but that's not what people think. So we have to really help people understand that these laws and policies and rules are codifying existing norms, but that's drastically misperceived for folks. So we have to help them understand that. And then really, is additional training needed to impact other behavioral beliefs besides just the perception of getting caught? Are we doing the good work of, okay, here's why we have a workplace policy about XYZ, and we want you to understand, here's how XYZ is potentially risky. Here's how it could impact your health or the health of a coworker. Here's all the reasons why we're doing it. So we're impacting more beliefs than just, if you do it, you're going to get caught. If you get caught, you're going to get punished. So that we really intentionally think about impacting those other behavioral beliefs. So I just leave you with those questions to start to think about how you can take maybe existing laws, policies, and rules, or potentially new ones if they become adopted, and really amplify them and their impact. I do want to take a moment for just a bit of shameless self-promotion. The center is extremely excited about a new activity or event we're going to do this year in June 2022 in Bozeman. We're going to host a symposium. We're very intentionally calling it a symposium instead of a conference. We're still figuring out what the difference is, but we know it's going to be different than a conference. It's going to be more interactive. It's going to be more fun. This one is going to be intentionally designed to be kind of small, so it's going to be more close and an opportunity for more engagement. So if that interests you, check it out on our website. Stay posted. Registration will be opening up later on, but you can certainly mark it down on your calendar so you don't lose that opportunity. And you can also learn more about us on our website, as well as follow us on Facebook or Twitter. So that is all the content that I wanted to share. We're pretty good on time. I think we have a mechanism, if we'd like, to open it up and have folks share any comments or questions. I know this is a new topic for me to explore and for members of our staff to explore. So we're very young in our understanding of these aspects, and I know it's extremely complex. So any questions or comments from folks who are on the line? And I don't know, Erica, you may need to unmute folks. I'm not sure the mechanism, or if folks want to just speak up.
Sure, I have unmuted everyone.
Thanks. So if anybody has a question or comment?
Hi, Jay. It's Wendy and Cody. How are you?
Good. How are you?
We're doing great. No, I thought it was a great presentation. No real questions at this point, but thank you very much. Lots of great information.
Sure. Well, thanks for the call out. Good to hear from you. Well, you can feel free to email us in terms of follow-up, or as I mentioned at the beginning, we will post this online, so if you want to watch or follow up on different aspects of it again, that'd be fine, and if you want to share it with others, that would be great. I want to really thank you for your time today. Thank you for the work that you do, and have a great afternoon.